So in this tutorial we're going to have a little look at rendering inside Creo, and what you're looking at on the screen at the moment is a part that I've already set up in the rendering section of the software, and I've already rendered out a quick final render from this. So you can see that that's just a PNG file that I've saved onto the hard disk. So we're going to look at some of the steps that you will go through to set that up. So the way that you would access the rendering section of the software is in the Applications tab, and it's that option at the end of the ribbon there. So it's the Render Studio option. So you can see that as I come out of the Render Studio tab over here, the part goes back to its default visualization style. So you can see I've got shaded with edges as the style that I'm using at the moment. Now this gearbox part is just a standard PTC training model, so I'll probably put a link so that you could download that. But the general sort of techniques that we use in here can be used with most Creo models, so that's okay. So yeah, you activate the Render Studio by clicking on that icon there. Then it will take you through into the Render Studio tab, and as you drop into the Render Studio, what will happen is you will get a rendered version. So the system is bouncing virtual light rays off your part, so you'll get a rendered version of your part rather than the standard visualization technique. All the time that you're actually viewing your part in that screen, the software is performing something that's known as refinement, so the image gets gradually more and more realistic. So you can see as I sort of rotate my view and then stop moving the view, so I can drag it with the middle mouse button here the same way that you drag when you're part modeling. The instant that I stop dragging this thing around and just let it render out, the system is creating a better and better quality image as the seconds tick by. What I've also switched on is this little information drop down here, which if we see where that comes from, there's a little drop down menu in the bottom of this real-time rendering option here, and if you click on scene information, that's quite a useful window to leave just hanging around, because what it allows you to do is monitor some things about the scene that's actually being rendered in real time in the window here. So this FPS is frames per second, so as I drag my view around, that's how quickly the system is updating in terms of number of frames of animation per second. The time that the current render has been left to refine, so that's just over a minute since I last rotated this view. The number of samples, in a very basic sense, the higher this number, the smoother your render will look. So you can see this render, because it's a metal, the material that I've applied to this part is a metal, that often produces a slightly sort of speckled surface finish, and you have to leave the render to sample for a very long time in order to reduce this this sort of speckled appearance that you get on metals. So you can see we're already up into the hundreds of samples. The example that I showed you at the start, so this screenshot here that we were looking at, where it still has a slight speckled appearance in some areas, but it's a lot better. I believe that rendered out to around 2,000 samples. So you can see the difference there between what we're looking at currently on the screen at around 150 samples and the one that I've saved onto the disk. So that gives you a rough idea of the sorts of lengths of time or number of samples that you're going to need to allow it to perform to get a smooth sort of metal finish on a part. Other things that are interested in here, number of triangles, that's just what the rendering portion of Creo is doing is it's taking your 3D model and it's converting it into a faceted 3D model. So examples of faceted 3D model file types might be an STL file that you would use for 3D printing, let's say. So what that does is it takes the curves and the curved surfaces in the model and it resolves them into a number of facets. So you can read up about faceted 3D models versus non-faceted ones, but that's essentially what it's done in the background. It's produced a faceted version of your model. So the higher the number of triangles, essentially, the smoother these curved areas are going to look. Units, that's not particularly interesting. We're using millimeters in this particular example. Field of view, so that's the virtual camera that we are using for this particular shot has a field of view, and you can relate that back to real cameras that you might use for photography in real life. So your field of view just means the angle that that view encompasses. So that's to do with the lens that you would use on the camera. So yeah, it's quite useful to leave that sort of information box open, certainly for the number of samples and the number of seconds since you stop moving the model around. But as a general rule, the model gets gradually better and better if you don't drag your view around or drag the model around and just let it sit and refine. So other options that we can play around with in here. Essentially, when you set a scene up, there are two main sort of inputs into how that scene is going to look. One is the scene setup itself, so that includes lights that you would have in the scene. It includes any sort of background that you would see behind the model, so you can see that we've just got a white background behind the model here, but there are other options that we'll look at. So that's lights, background, and also the environment that the model is sat in. So you can't see it in this view, but this model is actually surrounded by a photograph, if you want to think about it like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you some previews of some environments that I have actually downloaded onto my system. So I'm just going to drag this in now. So you can see here there's an environment here that was photographed using a particular technique that captures 360-degree view of a given environment. So you can see here we've got some kind of a garage that's being captured. So a technique has been used where multiple photographs have been stitched together to produce this spherical environment. And what the software does is it places that environment around your model, and it calculates what any reflections of that environment would look like on your model, and it allows the lights that were captured from that environment to actually provide some lighting onto your model as well. So we'll have a look at that. So all those sorts of setup items are contained within the scenes drop down within Creo. The other half of the setup that you're going to be concerned with is the appearances of your model. So that would be what sort of material is your model going to appear like. So in this case we've picked a metal material, so the appearance of this model is trying to mimic what a metal would look like, but there are other options in there. There are paints, plastics, there are organic materials like woods. So yeah, the appearance of the model is kind of the other half of how you would set your scene up. So you would play around with lighting and environments and background images. That would be half of the setup, and then the other half would be the appearance of the model itself. What sort of materials are you trying to make your model appear as if it's built from? So let's have a play around with the scenes first. So if we click on the scenes drop down, what you're looking at here is a menu that allows you to pick some inbuilt environments that are provided with Creo itself. So what these are, if we just hover over one of them and get the little tooltip, so it's describing what this is. It's a desert scene lit by a HDR image. Now HDR image is what refers to a high dynamic range image, or HDRI if you want to incorporate the word image into it as well. And what those are is what I was just talking about. They're special image captures of real environments normally that are captured using an SLR camera at multiple exposures, and what that leads to is a spherical environment that can provide lighting for your model. So it provides both lighting and reflections for your model. So back to this scenes drop down. So most of these default scenes have a HDR or HDRI in the background. So you can see here each one: default scene lit by a HDR image, desert scene lit by a HDR image. I don't think that one has an HDR in the background. Oh, sorry, that's the one that we're currently using, I think. And this one's lit by a HDR image. So yeah, you can play around with these. You can just click on one of them and your scene will update. So our scene is now loading in that HDR image. So you can see in this particular setup, if you had a car or maybe a motorbike, that would be quite a nice background to place that in. So what's happening here is we can see the HDR image in the background, and if we rotate our view round, you can see that it is in actual fact, as I said, a 360-degree image that's been mapped around our part. So you can see, you can rotate all the way around, and it's not just a flat image in the background. It's actually 360 degrees. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is you can see, because our part is made out of quite a shiny material, so the appearance that we've given it is that of a metal, you can see that the reflections here are actually being generated from that image itself. So you can see that this side of the part is shaded in green, and that's because over here on the image we've got quite a lot of foliage, so we've got quite a lot of green leaves. So that's our part is actually picking up the lighting conditions from that environment that we've set. Now in some cases, and the way that we had it set up before, you don't want to see the actual environment in the background. So you can actually change that. If you go in here and you go into edit scene, that allows you a little bit more fine control over the scene that you've selected. So maybe you'll call out a scene from the standard scene palette here, and then you go about editing that scene to more closely reflect what you want to create, the image that you want to create for your part. So if we go into the backgrounds tab here, currently that's set to use the environment as the background, and that's why we can see this environment, this HDRI environment, but there are other options in there. So you can just change it to a plain just colour. That was similar to the one that we were using earlier, and then if you want to change that colour, you just click on the box that's got the colour in there, and you can change that colour to anything that you want to. And you can see the window in the background is auto updating, so let's just change that to a nice solid block of colour like that. You can also see that the shadows that are being generated by the light from our environment image hitting our part and being obscured in certain areas is cast onto that blue colour. So you can see it's got a shadow that's active down at the bottom here. So what else could we do in here? We could have a nice colour blend. So rather than set that as one solid colour, we could set it as a blend. And then what that allows us to do, if we click on that option to change it again, is we can put one colour towards the top of the screen here. So let's click here and set what colour we want at the top of the screen. maybe sort of a warm colour towards the top of the screen, like that, and then set the colour towards the bottom of the screen. Maybe we'll have a slightly cooler sort of blue colour towards the bottom of the screen. Let the system update. So you can get various effects in here. You can have blended colours, you can have solid colour blocks, you can see the lighting environment as well, if that's more suitable for the product that you're creating an image for. Or the last option is just image. So what you can do there is you can just bring in a standard, let's say JPEG image. So we could get really confusing with ours, and we could bring in one of the renders that I've already done as a background image. But basically you can use any image that you've got on your hard disk, you can bring it in and drop it into the background there. So that's another quite useful option when you come to set up your scene for your render. So I'm going to leave mine as that blend of two colours. So some of the other options in here, we've been talking about these HDRI environments, and the way that you edit some of the properties to do with that is in the Environments tab here. So if we click on the Environment tab, give it a second to open, you can see a flat preview of our environment there. So you can see, we know that this is a straight road in our environment, but because it's had to unwrap that 360-degree environment into a flat rectangular shape here, you can see the lines on the road have become distorted. So you don't really want to take too much notice of this. The main reason that that is there is that some of these options here will change, let's say, the brightness of the environment. So that would be intensity. So if I reduce the intensity right down to say 0.1, then the lighting on my part almost disappears. So you can see we're having an effect on the intensity of the light coming out of that HDRI environment. So let's go the other way. Let's turn the brightness up a little bit. Let's turn it all the way up to 2. So you can see the environment now is providing a lot more light onto our part in that particular setup. And if we really want to blow out the image so that we can barely tell what we're looking at, if we bump it all the way up to 10, it's the equivalent of taking an overexposed photo. So you can see almost all of the part now is reflecting 100% white light. So we've gone too far in that instance. So let's drop it back down to 1 again. Other things that we can edit about the environment, the HDRI environment, is the saturation. So that would be how colourful are the colours in the environment. So if we wanted to retain all the intensity light information in this environment but take all the colour out of it, we could slide the saturation right down to 0, or as low as it'll go, -100, and you can see we've still got lighting on our part, but it doesn't have that green colour to it anymore. So the intensity of that lighting is being retained, but the colour information that was contained within it has been stripped out. So sometimes you don't want to fully remove the colour, you just want to dial the intensity of the colour down slightly. So you can see there, I'm still getting a slight green reflection there, but I've reduced the saturation of that colour. Other things that we can do, we can rotate the environment. So for this option, I'm going to make the environment visible again as the background. So let's turn the environment back on, if we can get it to come back. Let's see. So there's the environment back again, and if we now change this rotation angle, so let's change it very subtly to begin with. Let's go from the 25 that we're already on to just 26 and then press enter. And what you should see is the environment now is rotating itself around our camera, if you want to think about it like that. So let's bump this up a little bit further, 30 degrees. So we're gradually rotating the environment around our model. So that might be useful if the lighting that the environment is providing onto your model is not coming from the correct direction. It can be quite useful to try rotating the environment around a little bit and seeing how that affects your lighting on your model, because obviously there is sunlight in this scene as well as the green light that's been reflected off these leaves. So there's sunlight casting down onto this road environment, and I think we can see a little bit of it being reflected there. So those quite bright white highlights coming directly from the sunlight in the scene. So if we rotate this around a little bit further, you can see it's having an effect on the light as it falls onto our model there. So we'll rotate it a little bit further. So yeah, and you can play around with this with the drag handle here as well. It's just that depending on the speed of your machine, that might be more or less difficult. It depends how quickly your view will update. But yeah, you can rotate it round. You can also change the height of the environment. So if I play around with this, you can see that I'm increasing the vertical height of the environment in the background. So that's quite useful as well. And I can also, if you think of the environment as it's mapped onto the surface of a large sphere that surrounds your part, then this zoom option is changing the size of the sphere. So you can see the effect that that's having in the background. So when you're happy with that, you've done your environment lighting setup there. Maybe you've decided to keep the environment switched on in the background. You can actually add in more lights into your scene. So it's not just the environment itself that provides lighting for your part. You can also add in artificial lights, so that will be in the lights tab here. Now in this particular scene there's 2 lights already present in the scene, and if we want to see what effect those lights are having on the image of our part, what we can do is just temporarily turn them off and then back on again, so we can see the effect that they have. And the way that you do that is just click on this little eye icon in front of each of these lights. So let's switch them both off to begin with. So if you click on the eye icon in front of both of them, it doesn't appear to have had a huge effect on our part, but let's bring them back on one by one and see if we can spot the effect that they're having. So let's bring this one back. So you can see that highlight that I wrongly identified as the sunlight in the scene is actually this distant light reflecting off our model. So there are a few things that we can edit about this light. The first one is how bright is the light. So that would be the intensity slider here. So again, if we have a little sort of play around with this, so let's reduce it right down to 0.1, see what effect that has. So you can see that highlight actually shrunk by a noticeable amount there. So let's reduce it even further. Let's put 0.2. So yeah, it's all but disappeared on the model now. So you can see that we are having an effect there. So let's bump that back up to 0.1. What other things can we change about it? Now this softness slider, that light will cast shadows onto other parts of the model, or in some cases onto the floor underneath our model. And how crisp those shadows are, so the edge of the shadow, how crisp or how soft it is, can be adjusted here. So if you want a really crisp shadows that have a really well defined edge on them, you would turn the softness all the way down. Or if you want very sort of diffuse shadows that have a very soft edge to them, then you would turn that all the way up. The last thing that we can edit about this light is where is the light positioned relative to either our model or the environment, or in this case the camera. Now if we zoom out a little bit here, so I'm just rolling the mouse wheel to zoom out slightly, you can see that a light becomes visible there. Now I don't think that's the light that we're currently looking at. We're going to have to zoom out quite a long way. The light that we're currently looking at is locked to the camera. So it doesn't matter how much I zoom out, the light is coming with the camera. So I'm going to change that to lock to the model. and then when I zoom out I can get beyond where that light is positioned. So you can see that light, there's a preview of where the position of it, and what I can do is click and drag using these rings around my model to adjust the position of that light. And then the highlights on the model should change with respect to that. So whereas before we had a highlight coming in on the model down here, the highlight from that light is now, you can see it just visible on the edges here, and just picking up the highlights on the curves on these faces here. So yeah, you can add your own lights in there. So let's add one of our own. So there are various different types of light. One of the most interesting is the light bulb type. So this is going to simulate just a standard light bulb sat somewhere off scene. So you can see as I create that light bulb, it appeared in the lights manager here, and if I quickly switch it off and on, I should be able to see the effect that it's having on the scene. So yeah, it's adding a few extra highlights on. So it's casting a bit of light down here, it's catching this surface up here as well. If I want to change the position of that, again I prefer to lock these lights to the actual model itself, so their positions are relative to the actual model. So that means you can then zoom out or play around with the background image and the light won't change. The light will always be locked to its position relative to the actual part that you're looking at, or the assembly that you're looking at. So I'm going to change this here from studio to model, so it's locked relative to the model. Then if I zoom out a bit, I can see that light bulb and I can play with its position a little bit. Maybe I want to cast some light on the underside of this thing. So if I bring it down there, maybe I want to bump the intensity up a little bit, bump it up to 2, maybe a little bit more than that. And then play around with the on and off switch essentially and try and get a sense of what's happening there. Another nice thing that you can do with the light bulb option is you can set this to a physically sampled light. So if we click on physical light, we get a drop down list of different light bulb types. So you have old style incandescent bulbs, there's halogen bulbs in there, mercury bulbs. You can also define your own, but let's have a 150 watt incandescent. And you can see, because of the type of light that an incandescent produces, we get a much warmer colour coming off that incandescent bulb. Whereas if we change that to a halogen, the shade of it should change slightly, and change it to a mercury, and again the mercury bulbs have a much cooler, much bluer light that comes off them. So you can set your own physical lights up. So some of the light that's been provided to this model is coming out of the environment there, the HDRI environment, and some of the light we've defined specifically as these artificial light sources that we can then play with and position. So we kind of covered everything that you need to consider when you're looking at the scene itself. So you can load in one of the default scenes, you can pick a surrounded environment. If you want to load your own environment in off your own hard disk, you can do that as well. If you just click on the environment there, and what you get is a browser window where you can browse to wherever you've saved your environments. So we can see here I've actually downloaded some environments off a free HDRI site. So if you just go into any search engine and search for free HDRIs, there's lots of sites out there that will allow you to download these files and just use them royalty free. So yeah, that's always an option as well. The background image, we've talked a bit about the fact that you can use the environment as a background. You can just set it as solid color, you can provide a blend from top to bottom, you can pick an image and put that in the background as well. So that's all your scene setup side of your render. As I said before, the other side of it is the appearance of the actual part itself. This particular part's been set up with a metal appearance, but we're going to change that now. So let's say this had been, I don't know, powder coated or painted in some way. We can simulate that sort of finish as well. So we've kind of covered everything in the scenes bit. We're going to move on to the appearances button here. So if you click in the drop down from appearances, what are we looking at here? So we have a library of appearances that are stored as my appearances. We have some appearances that are currently applied to this model. So you can see there are two distinct materials on here, and we'll have a little discussion about why that might be the case. And then we have a system library towards the bottom here. So currently we're inside the system library in the subsection of standard metals. But I've already said that we're going to change this to more of a painted finish. So there are standard materials that replicate a painted finish in there as well. Let's go a little bit interesting and bring in the metallic paints. So we have some solid spray paint finishes in there. But the metallic paints had a bit more interest, where you get subsurface scattering underneath the actual initial surface of the finish. So let's apply this sort of orange metallic material. So how would you do that? So you click on the material in this window, and then it's easy to miss, but what the system's saying over here is select something that you want to apply that material to. So let's say I just wanted to apply that material to a single surface on the part. I would click on that surface and then click on OK. And if you give the part a minute to update, you can see that what it's done there is it's just selected that face that I clicked on, and no other face in the part has had that material applied to it. So that's one way of doing it. Now let's go back into appearances. What you can also see is it's now kept a record that the part has a portion of it with this metallic orange paint applied. So anything that's been applied to the model will appear here. So let's click on that option again, and rather than clicking on a single face, let's click on multiple faces. So we can click here and then hold down the control key and then click here as well, and then click on OK. And you can see it's applied it to multiple faces at once, so that's another option as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these appearances from these faces. So how would you do that? So if we click on clear appearance and then we click on the faces that we want to remove the appearance from whilst holding down control, that should get rid of the appearances that we've applied to those faces. So what are we going to do now? Let's go back in and let's apply this blue metallic. So there's the blue metallic, and rather than clicking on the model itself, what we're going to do is navigate to the top of our feature tree here and click on the entire part. So there's the entire part, and then when I click on OK, that blue material has been applied to the entire part except one face, which is this face here. And the reason it's not been applied to that face is that previously when I set this scene up, I applied a slightly different material, a slightly different metal to that face. The thought being that whilst the majority of this gearbox will have been cast and will have been quite a rough finish, it's likely that this mating face here will have been machined and will have had a slightly shinier appearance than the rest of it. So that face in particular has had a different material applied to it. But we know how you would achieve that now. So let's say I wanted to put this red material on there. I would select the red material, select the face that I want to put it on, click on OK, and then the red material is now applied to that face. So that's how you would apply a material. So let's say overall we're happy with this purple metallic colour, but we just want to tweak the shade of the purple slightly. So how would you do that? So you go into appearances, select the colour from the model, that you're interested in changing, right click on it and go to edit. And then what we can do, so because this is a metallic paint, it has two colours that are stored in there. It has a primary sort of base colour that we can edit. So if we go in here and let's say we want this slightly sort of pinker purpley colour, we can click on the colour wheel up here. You can also use these hue, saturation and brightness value sliders. I prefer to use these. The red, green, blue sliders you can use, although I don't find those as useful as the hue, saturation and value. So saturation again is how intense is the colour that you've selected. So the intensity of the colour, if you want to think about it like that. So when I slide it all the way to the left, it becomes almost grey. So the intensity of the colour disappears. The value is how bright is the colour. So you can see the effect that that's having. The brightness of the colour is the V, the value. And then the hue basically just revolves around this colour wheel. So as I change the hue, the actual shade of the colour itself will shift. So you can see we're going through the greens. What's next? We'll probably go through the yellow area. There's the yellow. We're coming towards the red area of the colour wheel, and then it starts again at the other end there. So I prefer to use these sliders when I'm sort of playing around with the colours of something. You might prefer to use the red, green, blue or the colour wheel there. It's entirely up to you. So let's set it back to something like what we were initially looking for. So something around there. You get the idea. In the metallic paints here, you can also adjust the edge colour, so we'll have a little play around with that and see what difference that makes. So if we bump the value of that up quite high, so we can see, you can see what effect that's having. As the edges sort of transition to one another, the surfaces, you get a little sort of highlight there. But the general setup for those colours in a metallic paint is to keep them quite dull. The flake colour, on the other hand, because this is a metallic paint, it simulates having a clear lacquered finish on top of the base colour, and underneath that lacquer there are slight little metallic elements that reflect the light. So you can kind of see that on our part there, and you can adjust the appearance of them. So you can adjust the appearance of those metallic flakes under the surface. There's various other sliders here. We're not going to go through every single one for every single part of material, every single type of material, but it's worth just having a play around with these and seeing what sort of effects you can achieve on your part. Which this system's really nice to do that with, because the rendered image in the main window there is constantly updating. So whatever changes you make here, they're reflected almost instantly in the actual rendering window here. So that's quite nice. So we've adjusted the appearance there, and obviously there are lots of other types of material in there that you can pull out. If we want to go really crazy, we can bring the wood materials out, and let's apply a wood material to the top level. There you go. It's not typically it's not particularly realistic, that, although I suspect if we let it render out for a little while, we might start to see little details in the wood itself. I think this is supposed to be a maple wood, but yeah, that's not really appropriate to this sort of part. So let's turn it back to some kind of metallic again. There we go. That's better. So we've done the setup in terms of the scene setup that we want to create. We've done a little bit of work on appearances, so what are the materials that are supposed to be applied to your part. Other things that you can play with, we have perspective turned on at the moment. So the standard way of modelling parts in Creo is to not have perspective turned on, because it sort of distorts the image that you're looking at slightly. But in terms of rendering things, having perspective switched on is a lot more realistic. When you take a shot of a product with a real camera, you will have some perspective effects that are applied. So it's good to have perspective turned on. Other things that we can play around with in here, so if we click on this drop down menu and go to RealTime Settings, this is basically how realistic the system is attempting to render your part. So there are a few presets in here. There's performance mode, which is quite useful for quickly moving your part around or making quick changes to the lighting that we've already seen that you can do that. So if we wanted to quickly move some lights around, it's good to have performance mode switched on, and that is because the view that you're looking at in the window here will update a lot quicker when you have performance mode switched on than when you have something, say, like full simulation. So full simulation will arguably produce a more realistic looking image, but it will update a lot more slowly. So as you play around with the settings, it's a lot harder to use because the frames per second drop to around 1. So yeah, if you're making quick edits, performance mode is really good. It ups the frames per second that the system responds at. But when it comes to rendering the thing, or when it comes to getting a more realistic looking preview, you would want to take it out of performance mode. So as we step up here, the realism of the image kind of steps up on each option on this list. So basic is kind of a good one to get a snappy response from the system. So when I rotate the model around, it's reasonably quick. When it rotates, it doesn't lag particularly. A good compromise between it being easy to use the system and getting quite a realistic representation is the product option. So that's a good balance between a realistic image and a workable frame rate on your system. Other things in here, you can go in and manually adjust these settings, which will override these presets. So if I want particularly good shadow quality, I can bang the shadow quality right up to the top there, and this changes from the product preset to a custom setting because I'm now custom adjusting the real-time rendering settings. Again, we're not going to go through every option in here. Self shadows are quite a useful one. You can kind of again get the effect that they're having. So when you switch them off, the hidden areas, or the areas that are deeper within this gearbox casing, look a little bit artificially bright, whereas when you turn self shadows on, it applies some shadowing algorithms to those areas and it darkens them down, a little bit more realistic. Ground illumination just means that some of the light rays that are lighting this part bounce off the ground surface and then bounce back up and hit the part. So it doesn't add a great deal to the final image, so I prefer to leave them off. Interior mode is more useful when you're creating interior spaces. So if you're using Creo to create some architectural interiors and you wanted to view them from within the building itself, you might switch interior mode on. For this particular example, I don't think we need that. And then the other thing that we were talking about earlier, which is the fact that Creo kind of tries to utilize all the CPU cores on your system. You can limit that here. So if you only want to use half of the cores, you can reduce that down, and it frees up other cores in the system to allow you to work on other bits of software or other applications. So it doesn't tie up the entire system, and you can kind of see that happening on my readout graph here. You can kind of see it was using a lot more, and then they all drop down to less utilization. So yeah, that's your real-time settings. When you're happy with your scene and you want to create a final rendered image, the way that you would do that is click on render up here, and then what you have to do is you have to give it a location where you want that image to be saved. You have to give the image a name as well. So I'm just going to put 3 in there because I've already rendered 2 of these out already. You have to set the image format, so JPEG's okay for us in this instance. It's going to apply some lossy compression to the image, but that's okay. If you want an uncompressed image, maybe a TIFF file would be good, but they take up a lot more disk space. So JPEG's good for us. Think about the resolution that you're setting as well. I'm going to set it so that I can go in and crop this down so it fits on a standard HD monitor. So I want it at 1920 by 1080, but the size of screen that I've set in Creo here, so the width and height of my preview window, doesn't quite equate to 1920 by 1080 in terms of its ratio of height to width. So I'm going to set that to 1080. This one's a little bit high, but then I can take that into an image editing program afterwards and just crop 7 pixels out of the height. The next sort of area down there is how long do you want to let the system render out your image for? So this is where our information screen up here becomes quite useful. So you can see that this image in the preview window has been sat for that many seconds. And it's taken 39, nearly 40 samples, and that image looks reasonably clean. It hasn't got any of that sort of spottiness that we saw on the metal. So that sort of speckled appearance, it hasn't got any of that. It's quite a smooth, quite a nice rendered image. So I would maybe set the number of samples in my final render to maybe just above this figure. So maybe 50 samples would be a wise choice. And I could be reasonably confident that I get a nice smooth resolved render at that setting. The other way of setting this is to say, well, I'm going to give over however many minutes to this render. So let's say 10 minutes, 30 seconds. And the system will just render for that length of time, and however many samples it's taken of the image in that time, that will be the render that you get at the end. So you can set it in terms of a time limit or in terms of a sample limit, either one. I'm going for samples in this this setup. The final options that you get at the bottom here are the render settings. So when we were setting up the real-time render there, and we were looking at some of the presets, product preset or interiors, or you can just replicate all those settings for the final render if you want, or if you untick that box, you can go in and you can manually set some of these settings yourself. So the final render can be significantly better quality than the real-time preview that you're seeing here. So maybe I do want ground illumination active in the final render, and maybe I do want interior mode. It's always an option. Anyway, when you're happy with the settings in there, you click on render, and then the system goes away and does the job of rendering the final image into the folder that you've set at the resolution that you've set as well. So I'll pause there and we'll come back in and see what it produces when it's finished rendering. So that render's finished, and if we have a look at the final file there, so yeah, that's largely okay. If we had to critique the image there, the HDRI that we're using for the background of this scene could be higher resolution. So some of the places where you can download free HDRIs on the internet, here's one of them, HDRI Haven. When you go in to download one of these environments, you can get quite high resolution, so 16K here, which equates to around 400 meg for a single image. So that's quite large. So an image of a higher resolution might provide a more presentable background here. So maybe if I was critiquing this, I'd say it might be better to hide the environment in the background and just either drop a static image in there, just load a background image in, or maybe just have the background as a simple colour, or maybe a blend of two colours. Other things, there's a little bit of sort of noise appearing in this surface here. You can see there's little spots on the surface, so maybe it would have been wiser to let this thing sit for a few more samples. So we set it as 50 samples maximum. Maybe you could double that. It didn't take that long to render this. It was only around 4 minutes to render. So we could bump the samples up slightly, or maybe double them. Maybe go to 100 samples and see what that looked like. So yeah, there are improvements that can be made to that image, but we're not going to go into all of the tweaking that we could do at this point. Just to round this up, so you've got the basic workflow there. If we just talk about some of the modifications that were made to the model itself to try and increase the realism of this render slightly. So one thing that I did to this model was I put some quite small fillets on some of the sharp edges on the model, and what I'm doing at the moment is I'm just zooming in slightly to highlight those. And that's kind of one of the reasons to put them on, to catch highlights from the lights on the render. So you can see here that there's some small fillets here. They're only 0.2 of a millimeter, these fillets. They're relatively small compared with the size of the entire model. But what they add to the render is they do literally catch the highlights in the scene. So you can see that these are being shaded in quite bright white, and then when they get into an area that's lit on the flat face, you can see they provide a little bit of runoff into the brightly lit face back into the base color of the material. So these are going into purple. So that can be quite a nice technique to add a little bit of extra realism to your render. Now obviously these rounds on the model, I'm just selecting them in the model tree here. They might not be intended to be manufactured on this model. They're just a byproduct of the manufacturing process, such that you can't expect a perfect edge from any manufacturing process. There will always be a slight round or a slight imperfection, and it's little things like that that add another level of realism to your renders. So you would put these kind of features in there purely for the rendering of the product image, and then you would probably suppress them. So you can right click on them and click on suppress, and then they've gone again. So any other activities that you need this model for, creating engineering drawings, they don't have to feature on that. They can be suppressed for that. You only use them to add that extra level of realism to the render itself. So yeah, that's one technique. It's quite widely used. In some rendering packages you can artificially add little rounds in there, but the Creo rendering package is quite basic in that respect. So just to round up this tutorial, let's say you're happy with your scene, maybe you want to come back in and edit it at a later date, but you're not sure. So one thing to be aware of, when I click save, everything about this will be saved, but if I want to specifically save my new scene that I've created, I can go in here and just take a copy of the scene itself. So you can see here that's a SCN file. What that would allow me to do is when I come back in, maybe I'm in a different model, not this model particularly, and I don't want to select any one of these pre-made scenes in here, I could then load that scene back in. So you can see there, you can browse and you can pull a scene file from one model through into a different one. Another thing just to be aware of there as well is if I tick that option there, it will take a copy of that scene file when I actually save this model file as well. So yeah, that's pretty much basic rendering in Creo. The basic setup steps: get the scene laid out. That obviously has a number of subsections to do with lighting, environment, background, etc., and then get the appearances of the actual model itself set up as well. And then the final step, which is just what sort of settings do you want the system to render with? Do you want it incredibly realistic but to take a bit more time, or do you just want a rough, quick approximation of what the model will look like, in which case it will run a lot quicker? So yeah, I think that's pretty much